April 4th, 1945. The Allied armies were racing across Germany. The weather was unusually warm for the season. Trees were blooming in the fields. To the soldiers, it felt like spring. But as the jeeps of the United States 4th Armored Division drove down a quiet country road near the town of Gotha, they hit a wall. It was not a wall of concrete, it was a wall of smell. The stench was thick and overpowering. Soldiers in the lead vehicles began to gag. It smelled like rotting meat mixed with burning hair. It was the scent of a slaughterhouse. General George S. Patton was riding in his command car nearby. He sniffed the air and frowned. He suspected a chemical plant or a glue factory processing dead horses. He called his officers to the front. He gave a direct order: find the source of that smell. 2 hours passed. A jeep raced back to the command post. The officer inside was pale. His hands were shaking. In the report, the man looked like he had seen a ghost. He approached Patton and spoke in a low voice. "General, you have to see this. You will not believe it." Why was the officer trembling? He was a combat veteran, but what he found was not a battlefield. It was an industrial site for death. Patton drove to the location immediately. The site was called Ohrdruf. It was a subcamp of Buchenwald. This was the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by the United States Army on the Western Front. The footage from that day shows the gates swinging open. What Patton saw inside those wires changed him forever. The man was known as Old Blood and Guts. He loved the mechanics of war. He had seen thousands of corpses on battlefields from Africa to Italy. He was a man hardened by decades of service. But at Ohrdruf, Patton walked behind a wooden shed and physically vomited. The camera records his reaction. His face is tight, his jaw is set. At first glance, he was a general, but in reality, he was a witness to a crime. After the sickness came the rage. It was a cold and terrifying anger. He looked at the lime-covered bodies stacked like cordwood. He saw the skeletal survivors who could no longer stand. He didn't just want to liberate the prisoners, he wanted to document the horror. Events accelerated. Patton ordered every citizen of the nearby town to march through the camp. He wanted them to see the bodies. He wanted them to smell the air. He forced them to look at the gallows and the cremation pits. There was no looking away. He gave a final order to his units. They were to take pictures of everything, every body, every bone, every tooth. He knew that one day, people would say this never happened. The liberators became the photographers. The story of the Holocaust was no longer a rumor, it was a recorded fact. Thus began the grim accounting of the camps. April 4th, 1945. General George Patton stood on a hill overlooking a quiet German town. Everything looked normal. The streets were clean, the houses were tidy. German civilians watched from behind lace curtains, then turned away. They acted as if the war was a dream. Patton watched them. He saw the smoke rising from a nearby forest and knew the truth. He didn't just stand there. He gripped his ivory-handled revolvers and issued a command that changed the rules of the occupation. Round them up, every single one. Patton's order was specific. Bring the mayor, bring the mayor's wife, bring the baker, the butcher, and the school teacher. The civilians claimed they knew nothing about the camp over the hill. Patton decided they would see it for themselves. This is the history of the liberation of Ohrdruf. It was the day George Patton forced an entire German population to walk through the gates of hell at gunpoint. It would end with a shocking double suicide that no one saw coming. To understand Patton's fury, you have to see what he saw. Ohrdruf was not a massive industrial death center like Auschwitz. It was a subcamp of Buchenwald. But the scale did not matter. The cruelty was absolute. When the tanks of the 4th Armored Division reached the barbed wire, the SS guards were already gone. They had fled into the woods hours earlier. The evidence of their crimes was fresh. Before leaving, the guards tried to erase the witnesses. They used machine guns on prisoners who were too weak to stand. They piled the corpses into a wooden shed like cordwood. They threw quicklime over the bodies to dissolve the skin and bone. But the Americans moved too fast. The SS ran out of time. The footage from that day is clear. American soldiers entered the gates and stopped. They didn't see soldiers, they saw walking skeletons. Men in striped uniforms weighed 60 or 70 pounds. Their skin was translucent. Their eyes were huge and hollow. The prisoners did not cheer or shout. They lacked the strength to make noise. Instead, they crawled toward the tanks. They touched the cold steel. They felt the painted white stars on the armor to ensure the metal was real. General Walton Walker was a combat veteran. He was one of Patton's toughest commanders. He saw the shed full of bodies and picked up the radio. He called Patton directly. "General, come immediately. You have to see this." Patton arrived shortly after. He brought General Omar Bradley and General Dwight Eisenhower with him. The scene was silent. The smell of decay and quicklime filled the air. Patton, the man who lived for war, looked at the piles of dead. He walked behind a barracks and vomited. He wasn't just sick, he was transformed. The liberation of Ohrdruf was no longer just a military objective. It was a crime scene. At first glance, the town nearby was innocent, but in reality, it was an accomplice. Patton turned to his officers. He told them to get the civilians. He wanted them to smell the air. He wanted them to see the faces of the men they had ignored for years. There was no turning back. The walk through the camp was about to begin. April 12, 1945. The American Third Army reached the gates of Ohrdruf. These soldiers had crossed an ocean. They had fought through the mud of France and the snow of the Ardennes. They believed they had seen everything war could offer. They were wrong. George S. Patton arrived in a jeep. He stepped out and walked through the entrance. His uniform was pressed. His helmet was polished to a mirror finish. He carried his signature riding crop. He looked like a conqueror entering a fallen city, but the image shattered within seconds. Why did the column stop? The smell reached them before the sights did. It was the scent of rotting meat and lye. Patton walked deeper into the camp. He passed the roll call square. He saw the pits. Bodies were stacked in layers like cordwood, 30, 40, 50 at a time. They were naked. They were skeletal. Most had a single bullet hole in the back of the neck. Patton stopped at one pile. He did not look away. He stared. The footage shows the change. His jaw tightened. A survivor appeared from a wooden barracks. The man was a living skeleton covered in rags. He crawled across the dirt toward the general. He reached out to kiss Patton's boots. Patton did not recoil in disgust. He stepped back gently and reached down. He helped the man stand. For a moment, the general's eyes blurred with tears. Then they found the torture shed. It was a small, cramped building. Inside stood a whipping block. The wood was no longer tan. It was stained a deep, dark crimson from years of use. Iron hooks lined the walls at head height. The guide explained their purpose. Prisoners were hung by their necks until they suffocated. The guide was a prisoner who spoke fluent English. He described the daily routine. The SS guards did not just kill. They beat men to death for sport. They used shovels. They used iron bars. The reaction was immediate. Dwight D. Eisenhower turned pale. He stood perfectly still like a granite statue. Omar Bradley looked at the floor. He was silent. He could not find a single word to say. But Patton was different. His body began to vibrate with rage. He walked to the back of the shed, away from the cameras. His aides watched from a distance. His shoulders heaved. The toughest general in the United States Army was physically sick to his stomach. He returned to the group a minute later. His voice had changed. The high-pitched command was gone. It was the cold, flat tone of a prosecutor. He spotted a young military police officer standing guard. "Did the people in the town know about this?" Patton asked. The MP stood at attention. He reported what the locals had told him. They claimed they were innocent. They said they thought it was a standard prison for violent criminals. Patton let out a sharp, bitter laugh. It was a sound without any humor. He looked toward the horizon. "They didn't know," Patton said. "The smell alone covers the entire county. They knew." He did not wait for Eisenhower to issue an order. Patton took charge of the situation immediately. He summoned the provost marshal. He raised his riding crop and pointed it toward the town of Ohrdruf. It was a picturesque German town. It had medieval walls, clean cobblestone streets, and flower boxes in the windows. He gave a single command. Every citizen was to be marched into the camp. They would see what was done in their name. The era of excuses was over. April 4th, 1945, Ohrdruf concentration camp. General George Patton stands before a mountain of corpses. The smell of decay is overwhelming. Patton turns to his officers and issues a direct order. Go into the town, find the mayor and his wife, round up every leading citizen, every banker, and every doctor. Bring them all here. An MP asks a question. What if they refuse to come? Patton does not hesitate. He touches the ivory handle of his Colt revolver. They won't refuse. He tells them to use trucks. He tells them to use bayonets if necessary. Every single person will tour this camp today. It was a punishment found in no military manual. It was forced witnessing. Patton wanted to destroy their denial. He wanted to rub their noses in the filth they had supported for years. The next morning, the trucks arrived at the camp gates. The citizens of Ohrdruf climbed out. They were dressed in their Sunday best clothes. Men wore suits and silk ties. Women wore expensive dresses and heavy coats. At first, they looked annoyed. They looked offended by the interruption to their day. Some complained loudly about the stench. Others held white handkerchiefs to their faces. Their posture was still arrogant. They were Germans. In their minds, they were still the master race. They did not understand why they were being dragged to this dirty place. Patton ordered the MPs to form a line. March them through, he said. He gave a specific instruction. Do not let them look away. If they close their eyes, use a rifle butt to poke them. Force them to look. The tour began. The civilians were led to the first pile of bodies. The crowd stopped. The chatter died out instantly. The complaining stopped. The footage shows there is no movement in the group. There was only the sound of the wind in the April 12th, 1945. The sound of boots on gravel filled the air. Some of the civilians gasped at the sight. One woman collapsed and hit the dirt. Military police did not stop to help. They pushed the crowd forward with the butts of their rifles. Move. Now. The soldiers led the citizens toward the whipping block. Then, they marched them toward the brick ovens where human remains were still smoldering. The MPs forced the Germans to stand at the edge of the pits. They were ordered to look directly into the open eyes of the corpses. General George S. Patton stood nearby. He watched the crowd like a predator. He studied every twitch and every blink. In the frame, the civilians looked shocked. Then, the shock turns to pure horror. But Patton noticed a third stage. Guilt. How much did they really know? It was the question of the century. Some men began to sob into their hands. Several women became hysterical, screaming at the sky. But many others simply stared at their own shoes. They did not look away because they were afraid. They looked away because they were guilty. They had always known. They simply chose to ignore the smoke on the horizon. Patton walked directly to the mayor of Ohrdruf. The man was shaking. His knees nearly gave way. Patton leaned in and looked him in the eye. You knew, didn't you? The mayor remained silent. He shook his head while tears ran down his cheeks. He could not find a single word. Patton turned to his staff officers. He gestured at the trembling crowd. He said they were not the master race. He called them people who had lost their souls. The tour of the camp lasted 2 hours. By the end, the citizens of Ohrdruf were physically and mentally crushed. Their arrogance vanished in the dirt. The dust of the death camp covered their expensive coats. The smell of burning flesh clung to their hair and clothes. Soldiers loaded them back onto the trucks. No one spoke. The vehicles drove back to the village. They returned to clean houses with neat flower boxes in the windows. Patton felt a grim satisfaction. He believed he had delivered a form of justice. That night, he sat at his desk and wrote to his wife. He described his rage. He wrote that he had taught them a lesson they would never forget. But for some, the lesson was too heavy. The mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife walked into their home. They closed the door behind them. They sat down in their living room. Perhaps they discussed the piles of bodies. Perhaps they sat in total silence. There were no witnesses to their final moments. The next morning, the bodies were found. The mayor and his wife had committed suicide. They left no note. They simply could not live with what they had seen. The lesson was complete. "9 in the morning, April 5th, 1945. American soldiers arrived at the mayor's residence to deliver new administrative orders. They knocked, no response. They hammered on the wood again. Silence. The soldiers kicked the door off its hinges. They entered the house and searched the rooms. In the bedroom, they found the mayor and his wife. Both were dead. Blood pooled on the floor from their slit wrists. On a nearby table sat a single note written in German. It was short. "We cannot live with this shame." What was Patton's reaction? At first glance, a commander might show pity, but in reality, Patton felt nothing. When the report reached him, he simply nodded. He stated that there were now 2 fewer Nazis to feed. It was a cold response, but Patton had spent the morning standing over piles of emaciated corpses. He had no mercy left for the perpetrators. Ohrdruf changed everything. It transformed Dwight Eisenhower. Usually, Eisenhower was a man of calm logic and diplomacy. After walking through the camp, he became a crusader. He stood among the dead and looked at the horizon. He realized something dangerous. One day, people would claim these crimes were mere propaganda. He knew the power of a lie. Eisenhower issued an immediate command to every nearby unit. He didn't just want soldiers, he wanted witnesses. "Bring cameras," he ordered. "Bring reporters." He demanded that every inch of the camp be photographed. He wanted every pile of bodies captured on film. He told his staff that the record must be perfect. He said that eventually, some son of a bitch would try to say this never happened. The orders didn't stop there. Eisenhower commanded thousands of American soldiers to march through the camp. He wanted them to see the filth. He wanted them to smell the rot. Before Ohrdruf, many GIs thought the war was about borders and maps. Now, they understood. One young soldier wrote in his diary that he would never feel sorry for a German again. He wrote that they were fighting monsters. Ohrdruf was a small camp. Buchenwald and Dachau were much larger, but Ohrdruf was the first. It was the moment the world woke up. Patton's anger had torn the veil of secrecy away. The local population could no longer use their favorite phrase, "Wir haben es nicht gewusst." We didn't know. Patton ensured they knew. He forced them to look. The footage shows the results. The friendly occupation ended that day. The process of denazification began in the mud of that camp. Later in the war, critics accused Patton of being too soft on former Nazi officials. They forgot April 1945. He was the man who exposed the crimes most brutally when the world was still blind. History remembers George S. Patton for different things: the ivory-handled pistols, the tank maneuvers, the speeches about blood and guts. But on that April afternoon, he wasn't acting as a general. He was a human witness to pure evil. He didn't turn his head. He grabbed that evil by the neck and forced the world to stare at it. The mayor of Ohrdruf chose death because he couldn't live with the truth. Because of Patton and Eisenhower, the world cannot forget it. The warnings were accurate. Even now, some try to deny these facts. But the record remains. The story continues. Next, the focus shifts to a salt mine. It involves a discovery of stolen gold and Hitler's hidden billions. Thus ended the silence of Ohrdruf.